many in the world, hear this conversation that we're having and saying, it's very critical of Israel. And I want to be clear that that's not our goal here. Our goal is to make things better in Israel and to look at the things that are happening on the ground, which are shocking and disturbing as we've laid out. But give us some good news a little bit here, Orly. What's the story?
Last week, I attended the People's Peace Conference in Tel Aviv called It's Time. The central event, which was really thousands of people under the title, it's essential, it's possible, it will happen. So giving us sort of a sense that, first of all, this is the end game that we should all strive for, that it happened in other parts of the world. And it's definitely going to happen here too. Even if that now seems reality, which is far away from us, we have to have it in front of our eyes. We have to continue to talk about it in order for this to happen. And I keep thinking about the right-wing camp that is now in power. They have had the vision in front of their eyes for many years, right? Of the state of Israel that they want to materialize, which is, of course, not my vision, but they made it come true, right? Even though 20 years ago, nobody would have thought this is something that could happen. So I think we should learn from them this, right? So to believe in what we think we should, bring about, and not to lose sight of this vision, even when circumstances are very difficult. Welcome back to the Pluralist Podcast from both sides of the ocean. I'm Orly Erez-Likhovski, Executive Director of the Israel Religious Action Center.
I'm Rabbi Josh Weinberg. I serve as the Vice President for Israel and Reform Zionism for the URJ as the Director of ARTA. Great to be with you today.
Wonderful. And this week, we're going to take a look at what's going on now, today, these days, concerning Israel's democracy, talk about what's going on in the U.S. It wouldn't be an easy episode. A lot of disturbing things are happening, but it's so important to talk about them and to see what we can do about them.
And before we just jump into that, Orly, I want to take a second to give our listeners a reminder that next week we will be hosting a half day of learning on Sunday, May 17th, called Israel in Depth. This is for leaders all over the reform movement, whether in North America or abroad. It'll be a chance to really go deep on a number of different issues. Of course, we're going to have a keynote conversation with Rachel Goldberg Poland, mother of slain hostage Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who has a new book out that you will not want to miss this conversation. And of course, we're so honored, Orly, that you get to take part in this.
Yeah, it's really my pleasure. I'm going to share a session with Rabbi Jonah Pesner, the Executive Director for the Religious Action Center, and together with Rabbi Lindsay Danziger and Blake Ziegler, we're going to talk about how do we talk about Israel, what can we do to organize around issues pertaining to Israel, democracy, pluralism. It's going to be really interesting. Please be there with us. Make sure to sign up and join
maybe
us.
A sprinkle of social justice in there, we'll
For
throw it in.
sure. Sure. Yes, definitely. It's going to be interesting, and be sure to be there with us. But, before May 17th, we want to talk a little bit about the present, about the recent week. A lot of things are happening in these very, very chaotic days.
Yeah.
We are, first of all, in the midst of this uncertainty about whether the war with Iran is going to be resumed. Every night, we're sort of every day, every morning, we're like, okay, we didn't have the war resumed during the night. And obviously, it's very, very uncertain. And it's, not an easy time to be here with this uncertainty looming back.
Yeah, it feels like from abroad, like, people are, jumping on this opportunity to go out and fill the restaurants. And, yesterday was Lag BaOmer. Orly, did you do a bonfire and go sit outside or
No,
are those days, only for when kids are young? And
yeah, no. We are, the reform movement now in Israel really said, from ecological perspectives, we shouldn't really set up a bonfire, but, think about Lag BaOmer from a different perspective. But yeah, my youngest son did go bonfire. But it's true. It's like people are like, okay, we have to do a lot of things because who knows if tomorrow, next week, in 2 weeks, we will be able to go out and, run around, go and sit in restaurants. So yeah, everything could change really, really, really quickly.
yeah, I feel like Lag BaOmer is somehow, or it might win the competition for the least observed holiday in North America, especially among liberal Jews. It's just not so much of a thing that people know about. But I did a modest, my neighbors and I did a little did a little modest bonfire in our back patio.
Yeah, it's
Because,
true. But
what are you going to do?
it's true. But I think the feeling is that a lot of things are going out, on fire around us. It is a feeling of a
Ooh,
lot of chaos. Especially when we're thinking about instances of violence and racism and hatred. And unfortunately, we have seen an unbelievable increase in all those in recent weeks. And I think one of the things that shocked Israelis and may have traveled overseas as well is the murder of Yemaenu Zelka, a 19-year-old who worked in a pizzeria in Pizza Hut actually. Um,
yeah.
on Yom Ha'atzmaut Eve in Petah Tikva, and a few kids, teenagers, came into the pizzeria and sprayed, with a spray, sort of the string spray that
The
everybody
silly
uses on a
string that people,
yeah,
yeah, spray on, I remember on Ben Yehuda Street all the time. Right, 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 right. And
yeah,
he
and
just asked them to stop.
yeah, he just told me, don't do it inside the restaurant because obviously it doesn't make sense. And they stopped, but then later when he finished his shift, they actually just stood and waited for him to get out of the pizzeria and stabbed him. A group of maybe 10 or no, even more teenagers stabbed him to death. And he died just for saying, politely, please do not, do it within the pizza. This was shocking, even in an atmosphere that we see so much violence around us, because it really showed how cheap life has become and how easily people can lose their lives just for a simple request for other people to act politely. Actually, it's
And of course,
yeah,
we learned a little bit about his family and that, he was helping to, make money and to put food on the table for his family, essentially.
yeah,
And his
yeah.
siblings all looked up to him, and he was the, really the sort of the big brother and the leader of his family. And I think there were some reactions that we want to discuss a little bit, in the political scene that were really terrible. And by the way, I don't know if you saw this on the news. They played the MADA, Magen David Adom emergency call
Mhm.
that they made, that people just left him to bleed, and had someone called earlier, he could have been saved, and it was just really terrible.
Yeah, and I think one of the exceptional thing was actually that all teenagers who studied, the whole group was actually apprehended, which is very unusual for the current police, right? Because they usually just don't
Yeah.
do anything about it. But it had like a high public profile, so they had no choice. So we hope that they're actually going to be justice is going to be served. But
I mean,
it's
it shows
just
when they want to, they can, right?
exactly, exactly. It's just a
Yeah.
matter of where you put your resources and whether you're actually doing your job or trying to serve the racist minister of police. I think it showed us that that's just part of the very violent reality that we're living in, of complete intolerance, of a very violent reaction to anybody saying something that you don't agree with. And I think we've talked about the case of Dr. Alex Sinclair, in the previous episode, which was also
Massive,
some
yeah.
kind of violence. And of course, the Ra'anana pogrom. So all of those just combined to a very, very troubling reality.
When this was brought to Minister Ben-Gvir, who oversees the police, his response was so callous and just kind of brushed it off and saying, what, could I put a police officer at every pizzeria? Like, no, that's impossible. Not to say like, oh my God, this is a tragic thing and we have to get to the bottom of it.
Right. I mean,
And you
because
have to
obviously
wonder, yeah,
the role of the police obviously is to protect the citizens, right? It's like the basic role of the police. So,
you would think,
maybe
yeah.
maybe try to do that, right? It makes sense. Yeah, for sure. And then a week later we saw a terrible video of a religious guy walking through the old city and pushing a nun that just went, quietly before him. She pushed her and she fell, and then he came back and kicked her, and she
Kicked
suffered,
her while she was down. Yeah, yeah.
she suffered, a lot of damage. And we've seen, unfortunately, so many instances of violence against Christian clergy in the old city, often by ultra Orthodox young people. We've been following this for many, many years and demanding action by the police. I think this case was unusual in the sense that it was just so blunt violence, that obviously was not triggered or provoked in any way. And people were shocked because of, how it was filmed, and it was just pure violence
Well,
and
that's, I
hatred.
think, the fact that it got caught on video, the whole thing. This was one, I don't know if it's a silver lining, but you did see in the video, another innocent bystander coming to, try to intervene a little bit and help him. But it's just, I mean, I can't help but think about the accusations of Jewish supremacy and feeling like, okay, like, why would you do that? Why would you do that? Like, there's just someone walking by and came and attacked her. And I just want to give a quick shout out to our colleagues, Rabbi Benny Minich and Rabbi Tamir Nir, who came and visited the French Lutheran Bible College that she was affiliated with in the Old City in the Christian Quarter. And, just to give our solidarity there and to say that this does not represent Judaism. Okay. And that this is totally unacceptable and we should not tolerate such behavior.
Yeah, yes, completely. And, to top it all, this week we had a discussion at the Knesset Committee for the Rights of Children. And that the subject of the discussion was, the terrible phenomenon of increased violence among teenagers. And that you would have thought that, people would say, well, this is a terrible phenomenon. Let's see what can be done. And why does the police don't do its role? Because, this year we've seen an all-time record high of the number of casualties of murders in Israel, mostly Palestinian citizens of Israel, but not only. So you'd have thought that there would be some kind of, frank discussion. Obviously, this is not what happened under the current Knesset. This committee is chaired by a member of Knesset from the Likud named Keti Shitrit. And let's start with the fact that criminals and the head of criminal gangs were invited to the committee, not as someone to, claim something against, but actually as guests of honors of how we can learn from them how to treat violence. I mean, you would have, it's really mind-boggling. And one of
them said something quite problematic, right?
Yeah. So one of them, who is a prominent criminal, said about this murder that we just mentioned of the guy in the pizzeria. He said, well, the guys who actually stabbed him didn't want to kill him. They just wanted to stab him, as if this is something that is okay.
As if that's
or
okay,
legitimate.
right? Like that. Oh, great. Yeah.
And, just imagine that he was invited to the table and actually relatives of victims of violence who were also invited didn't have a place to sit around the table of the committee, and they didn't have a spot, but the criminals did. So it just shows you the priorities of this current government and how it views this phenomenon. And obviously, relatives of the person who was killed spoke from the bottom of their heart, and it was obviously terrible and really heartbreaking. But, we have no expectations that anything is going to come out of this discussion. And it was really, again, so blunt, the disregard for human lives and the disregard of not understanding what the government should do, what the police should do, and that actually things should be different.
Well, it is deeply troubling. And I think, we'll get to in a few minutes what we want to do and what, hopefully what will motivate Israeli society to make change. But I caught another, fascinating piece from the news the other day that, we've discussed this a few times about the death penalty for terrorism bill. And the fact that, days after the hostages were returned in October, which was a really hallelujah moment. But when many people were deciding what to do with their yellow ribbon pins, we saw a number of members of Otzma Yehudit, of the Jewish Power Party, switch out their yellow their yellow ribbons, their pins on their lapels, and if you had to look closely, but they changed it for a noose. Right, for to symbolize the importance of capital punishment for terrorists, as they say, but it depends which terrorists. And then just this week, after the bill passed in the Knesset, just this week, Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir celebrated a birthday in which his wife presented him with a cake, not saying Mazal Tov Ben-Gvir or anything like that. Okay, you know what? Even if he would have put a picture of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple rebuilt, or Hebron, or something, I could have said, okay, that's his politics, fine. But what did it have on its cake? Orly, give us the punchline. What was the picture on his cake?
It says, "Happy birthday, Ben-Gvir." He had a huge noose with a lot of whipped cream around it, and it says underneath, under this, "Sometimes dream come true." Okay, now there's a lot of talk. It's unbelievable. It's really beyond like our wildest imaginations. And, there are a lot of talk about how this government is not only the most extremist and racist and homophobic and really the most terrible we've ever had. A lot of people call them death eaters, right? Because they celebrate death instead of sanctifying life. This is literally eating death, right? So taking death and making it something to celebrate, literally consume, instead of trying to fight all of those terrible things that are happening around us. So it's, yeah, what can we say? It's like we're out of words when you see something like that. And add to this that this was a huge party to which a lot of people were invited, including top senior police officers
Mm.
and top criminals, right? Why not be together, right? The criminals with the police force, really unbelievable. I think this was really an unbelievable event that sort of brought together the terrible things that are happening and characterize this government, right? That they have no intention of actually working for the public good, but actually serving the people that just gives them more power. And obviously, people in the police know that the only thing that they need to do is actually, say good things about Ben Gvir and do whatever he wants in order to be promoted instead of actually protecting the citizens, right? It doesn't matter to anybody whether they're doing the job, they're going to get promoted and stay in the police force if they do whatever Ben Gvir wants, which is, right, acting against protesters against the government, obviously acting against Palestinians, left-wing people, liberal Jews, and not doing anything actually to what, they're supposed to do. It's really mind-boggling.
Yeah. And as if, our listeners hopefully are not terribly depressed and haven't turned off the podcast by now. You had the opportunity last Friday to go on a tour in the field, in the shetach, as we say, out to the West Bank. You went with, of course, our colleague, Rabbi Arik Asherman, who's frequently there as protective presence. Tell us a little bit about, why was it important for you to go there, and what did you see there?
Yeah, so it was organized by Rabbi Asherman Torah Tzedek and Rabbis for Human Rights and Reform rabbis, and we were several, members of Reform communities around Israel that wanted to see with their own eyes what's actually happening, because we've seen more and more reports of, extreme settler violence, of, expulsion of whole communities from their homes, of violence and terror that are happening really every day. And I think more and more Israelis understand that a lot of things are happening. So it's much more discussed than it used to be, which in and of itself is important, but obviously it's not enough because things are not changing. So those things are
Yeah.
continuing to.
So where in the West Bank did you go, and what specifically did you see there?
So we went to two villages. One is Mukhmas, which is sort of, I would say, northeast to Ramallah, and then a little further north to Duma. And we've met there with Palestinians who were driven out of their homes, who were subject to, terror, trying to, put arson to their homes, trying to.
And Duma, of course, is known to us sadly from over 10 years ago, from the
Right.
2015 case of the Dawabsha family, right, where
Right.
they were.
Yeah,
Their
there
house
were.
was torched. Yeah.
Right, and they were murdered, parents and their child, and we met the grandfather who raises the child who was actually rescued survived. So yeah, obviously we've seen a lot of people who are affected by the really daily terror that they're experiencing. The lawlessness of this reality, and obviously with the fact that neither the police nor the army are doing anything to protect them, if at all, they actually often back the settlers, and really they don't have anybody to turn to other than really the amazing people who are doing the protective presence, who are trying with their bodies to protect them. And
Right, because the army and the police don't protect them. And was this like, just tell me about your emotions for a second, because how far away from your house was this, like, that you had to travel?
yes, so it's
How many worlds away? Yeah.
So it's kind of amazing, right? Because it's about an hour drive from my home, which is like nothing. And plus, I have to say that, I mean, we were lucky in the sense that it was very, very, very quiet, very pastoral. Like we saw no soldier, no settler came to stop us, which is sometimes the case. And I think the striking difference between how surreal and how quiet everything looked and the stories we've heard was really, really hard to grasp. I was shocked to see so many illegal outposts on really every hill, on top of every
Mm.
hill. It's literally everywhere. And sort of it got me thinking that, we keep saying, how come this government really has complete disregard of the rule of law? Has no understanding of the need to restrict its power. And then, of course, you understand because if the people who are running the government, many of them have, live in the West Bank, this is what they know, right? They don't care about anything. They do what they want. They carry no consequences. So, of course, now they brought it into Israel, into the Green Line, and they want to do whatever they want. And they don't want the court to do anything that would stop them. They don't want the Attorney General to tell them they can't do it. They don't want the public, the NGOs, the media, everything, right? Because they're used to this lawlessness and to the Wild West, right? And I think it's important for Israelis to understand that it's not something that you can stop beyond the Green Line. It does not stop there. So first of all, what's happening there is
Well, let me
terrible.
ask you about that actually,
Yeah.
because like, what do the averages? I mean, like, you do this for a living, and you're in the weeds all the time, and even if you're not there, every week, like, what do you think the average Israeli is thinking about, if there's such a thing as an average Israeli? What are they thinking about this in terms of, like, is this just, oh, let's not pay attention to that, don't bother me with that, they're all crazy out there, I don't want to know about it, or like, I just want to, go about my life. And then what happens when they're confronted with the reality of really what's happening?
So it's a good question. I think that many Israelis sort of turn a blind eye, don't want
Mm,
to hear about that. I think maybe we can see that as a positive thing because people find it very hard to associate themselves with things that are happening there because they're so terrible. I think in this sense, a lot of Israelis didn't want to hear about what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza, right, during the war because they couldn't
sure,
understand
sure.
this is happening in our names. I think people are really, I wouldn't even say indifferent, they are suppressing the whole idea of what's happening there. And I think because we've seen such an increase in the number of violent attacks by settlers toward Palestinians in the West Bank, I think it is being more discussed. So people find it hard to ignore because it has become such a huge issue. Actually, we've seen in recent weeks the leaders of the settler movement, including Smotrich, have spoken against it, including top, right-wing journalists have said, there shouldn't be violence against Palestinians in the West Bank because they understand that it's sort of one step too far for people to understand or accept or go about their days without thinking
Yeah,
about that.
yeah.
So
It's not a good look for us, right? It's not, yeah.
exactly, exactly. So I think people understand there's a problem. It does not mean
Forget about that. It's like against the Torah or something like that.
of course, right.
Um,
Yeah. So
and of course,
yeah.
we're working hard within Kakao, and we actually had a pretty, I would call it a success, actually, a victory, in that Kakao voted during its meeting to not fund any of these programs that would help build up what we call the Hilltop Youth, or Youth at Risk, out in the West Bank, which we know resulted in some taking part in some of this violence against Palestinians and building outposts. So
Yeah, that
that's
was
a critical success.
completely.
But
That's a
Orly,
huge that yeah, I do want to say that it's a
yeah,
huge
sure.
step because obviously all this mechanism that is going on the West Bank needs a lot of budgets, right? So the government is funneling so much money through many, many routes to this project, and including the illegal outposts from which the Jewish terrorists are coming and perpetrating what they're doing. And so it's critical to cut down those budgets as much as possible. So I think really, working in many ways, both to raise awareness, to cut down the budget, to tell more Israelis to talk about this, and to demand action is super important. And obviously, it's not enough to talk, right? We need change on the
Yeah.
ground, and obviously, this government has no interest in actually stopping this. But we have to continue to push as much as possible in order really to bring about change and to raise a Jewish voice that this is, outrageous and should not be allowed, to happen any further.
Yeah. And I think people listening, speaking of change, I want to hear if there's, anything positive going on. And I think many in the world, hear this conversation that we're having and saying, it's very critical of Israel. And I want to be clear that that's not our goal here. Our goal is to make things better in Israel and to look at the things that are happening on the ground, which are shocking and disturbing, as we've laid out. But did anything happen last week that could be, good news, or that was uplifting and inspiring? Give us some good news a little bit here,
Yeah,
Orly.
so
What's the
so
story?
actually last week, yeah, I attended a very optimistic event, which was the People's Peace Conference in Tel Aviv, which was organized by a coalition of peace organizations. I think over 50 peace organizations called It's Time, and they have an annual conference, which I think just becomes more important every year as it has become much more difficult to talk about peace. So, we have grown up with, songs about peace. Everybody strives for peace, whether you're a right-wing person, left-wing person. Of course, this is our end goal. This has not, is not the case anymore. So people hardly talk about this. It's not even people on the, on the center, centrist political spectrum are afraid to talk about this because this has become to be associated heavily with the extreme left, as, by the way, are
Yeah.
human rights, right? Instead of actually being universal values that all of us strive for, are considered associated with one part of the political spectrum that could drive away voters and prevent you from actually gaining power. And that's tragic. And I think it has become especially so after October 7th, where any person talking about peace today and the two-state solution is considered naive, is considered that he has an illusions that nobody.
Or worse, even a traitor. I mean,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, right. That's
And was this gathering, this peace conference, was this like a handful of left-wing activists and a few Palestinians, or like who was there? How many people were there?
So there were thousands of people there, and they had a lot of panels, both talking about different
Incredible.
issues, and then like the central event, which was really thousands of people under the title, it's essential, it's possible, it will happen. So giving us sort of a sense that first of all, this is the end game that we should all strive for. That it happened in other parts of the world, and it's definitely going to happen here too. And so there were a lot of people, including a lot of bereaved families on both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians, talking about the loved ones that they lost, but that they want a different future and that they actually chose this future of peace because what they have gone through, talking about other places like Ireland where conflicts have been resolved, and then finally having members of Knesset actually go on the stage and saying, this is what we're going to do. We have very concrete steps on actually making it happen. Plus, we have to remember to talk about it, even if this is a vision that now seems sort of a reality which is far away from us. We have to have it in front of our eyes. We have to continue to talk about it in order for this to happen. And I keep thinking about sort of, the other side, right? So the right-wing camp that is now in power, they have had the vision in front of their eyes for many years, right? Of the state of Israel that they want to materialize, which is, of course, not my vision, but they made it come true, right? Even though 20 years ago, nobody would have thought this is something that could happen. So I think we should learn from them this, right? So to believe in what we think we should bring about and not to lose sight of this vision, even when circumstances are very difficult.
I mean, I'm listening to you, and I also listened to many of the speeches at the Vidat Shalom, at the peace, conference. But allow me to be cynical for a second. And I just want to get your take on, what you would say, because many people, both in Israel and here in North America, are saying, that's great. It's essential. It's necessary. It's possible. But is it really? Because, you know, with whom are we going to make peace right now? There's still, the Palestinian Authority is weak. We're not really in the position to negotiate with Hamas. There's still, pay for slay going on, right now in the PA and the West Bank. And so when they talk about this, like, is it just talking, or is something actually possible, and with whom? And what can we say to all those who are not easily brought into the peace camp right now?
I think obviously there are a lot of difficulties, and many of the things you've said are true. We have a real problem, by the way, with lack of leaders on both sides. Looking back, we need brave leaders on both sides. Some of them, unfortunately, we saw the leaders that brought peace on both sides have lost their lives, but there were brave leaders that were willing to take chances and risks in order to bring about peace. And, one of the quotes that they brought during the conference was the quote of Menachem Begin, when President
Mm.
Anwar Sadat of Egypt came to visit the Knesset in November of 1977. And it was Begin, right, a right-wing leader, who said, war is avoidable, but peace is inevitable. So that's a very powerful statement that just imagine, Netanyahu saying this today, right? But this is something that we should strive for. Okay, so let's put it in front of our eyes and then do whatever we can to try to make this happen. And this means obviously trying to strengthen the moderate parts of, right, the Palestinian Authority rather than Hamas and Qatar, right, which is completely opposite to what this government is doing. and also trying to think of somehow bringing about a political solution, right? I mean, what the problem with this government is that they
Sure.
decided not to do anything. Let's manage the conflict. We would not do anything and everything would be okay, right? This is what they said before October 7th, and literally
Sort of
nothing was
perpetuate
okay.
the status quo. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. So
yeah.
they thought we can continue with the status quo forever. And I think most Israelis, despite being very, scared and suspicious, understand that there needs to be a political solution rather than a military one. I mean, the military solution is not the end
Yeah.
game. So obviously,
I
it's
mean,
not
that's my
clear.
favorite Hebrew word, the word conceptia, right? Which is, again, not really Hebrew, but
Yeah. Yeah.
the that concept that we could just, let it go and, and nothing would,
Right,
would
right. So
happen. And
I
of
think really
course,
changing the concept, changing the wording, and really exercising our imagination in imagining a different future is important. Even to just talk with our children. We're trying to bring about a future where we're not living on our sword, right? We are trying to bring about a different future, and the fact that we had both Israeli and Palestinian voices during the peace conference talking about that we wanted a different future was very powerful. And we have a lot of work, in front of us, obviously, a lot of educational work, a lot of, public work, but it's important to know that,
right. And,
we're
and
going there.
and absolutely. And I think that, of course, it starts with us. And, we can't ignore the fact that this peace conference and everything that's happening right now is really coming, let's say 5 months ahead of the next elections in Israel. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this will be the first time that Israel has lasted an entire 4-year period without elections, maybe even since 1992.
Yeah.
And so how we will do lots of more episodes when it gets closer to the elections, and we'll, bring in experts and talk about that. But how is that translating into, the political arena leading up to elections? Or of course, lots of, unifications and political
Yeah.
partnerships emerging now in the past week.
Yeah. Well,
How are you seeing that?
obviously it's very different from American politics because, we have zillion parties and everything is, changing as we speak. But we did have sort of the Big Bang in the sense that
Yeah.
Bennett and Lapid decided to run together. And that was surprising in the
Just to
sense.
clarify, that's both former prime ministers Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, who have had a long, let's call it a bromance, and they decided to unify here this time. Yeah. What do you think
Yeah, and
about it?
it was surprising in the sense that Bennett kept, trying to get more right-wing voters, and Lapid is portrayed as being left-wing, right? I mean, so this,
He's
merge,
left wing for the right wingers
right,
and
right,
more centrist for the left wingers, right?
right.
He's, yeah.
Right, but he's definitely not considered right wing on any account. So in this sense, it was surprising. However, I think the attempt to lure more right wing people to vote for Bennett was an illusion in any way. So I think any unification makes sense because we have just too many parties, and we know that from the previous elections there were so many votes that were lost because two parties didn't cross the threshold. So it's clear that there needs to be unification. I don't know if this is like the best one, and obviously we have another political player, which is Gadi Eisenkot, who is now not a member of Knesset, but in the polls he gets a lot of votes. In the polls he gets like 15 mandates out of 120, so that's a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not clear whether he's going to join them or join others or run alone. So I think there's still going to be a lot of political changes. Something that was very disturbing was that Bennett announced that if he's going to be prime minister, he's not going to
Right.
sit in a coalition with Arab parties, including Mansour Abbas, who is, sat in his coalition in the previous coalition.
Which he did before in
Which he did.
2021, right? Yeah,
Right.
of
And
course.
that's
Yeah.
disturbing on many fronts. First of all, just look at the numbers, right? The numbers just don't match because you need the Arab parties in order to have a strong majority if they want to replace Netanyahu, right? Because otherwise it's really on the margin, like having six.
Right. And my sense was that he was doing that just so, that he could garner the right vote and he would be seen as an alternative, as, the AI images were coming out of Bennett and Lapid, with Ahmed Tibi and Mansour Abbas, some of the Arab Knesset members. I think we'll probably see more of that.
Right.
My bigger concern with Bennett and Lapid is that they did this too early, and that, unlike American politics, Israeli campaigns are are much shorter, and they only get heated up right, in
Yeah,
the
but
weeks before the
yeah, but
election.
I do want to go back
But
to
yeah,
the delegitimation of the Arab party and the Arab votes because I think it's
sure. Yeah,
important.
yeah,
It's
it's
not
important.
only the issue of the numbers, right? I think it's an issue of the principal issue that basically they are sort of playing the game of Netanyahu and the right, right? So they're accepting his rules of the game, which means that the Arab votes are considered illegitimate, and they're trying to play within the confines of this game. And this is like a huge mistake because, as I said, no right-wing person is actually going to vote for Bennett. So why are you doing this? You're just actually, just
Mm,
enraging people within the liberal camp, delegitimizing the Arab votes, which obviously we need. We want the Arab, population to go and vote, and obviously have political representation and be counted as legitimate partners. And it really drove a lot of people crazy because it shows that you really don't pose an alternative, right? You're actually offering Israelis something which is sort of similar because both Netanyahu and Bennett are saying that Arabs are not legitimate. So in this sense, I think it's very
yeah, and I
troubling.
think Bennett is not, Bennett is still ideologically quite right wing. I mean, I think he, opposes a Palestinian state and would like the greater land of Israel, all of that, even though I find him to be a pragmatist. And I actually thought he was, a good prime minister. Depends on how we're judging that. But I
Right.
thought,
Right. So it's a good question. What's going to happen if we're going to have sort of a rerun of the previous government, sort of change government, which we had high hopes for, but did not bring about a lot of changes. Right. So we have a lot of work in our hands to think about things that need to be changed and the way to do them. To your question about sort of why do it so early, it's a good question. I think it did bring about some momentum to the liberal camp, seeing that there is a change and maybe, people would, gather around one big party, which, garner momentum and maybe change sort of the, balance between the two blocks. It's true that a lot of things can happen. As you say, it's more than 5 months away. But I think it does make sense because, for different parties in the same bloc fighting each other, it didn't work well for
sure,
for liberal values and it did make
well, they'll all cancel each other out.
yeah,
Yeah, for
yeah, but
sure.
I know that this actually last week you had a disturbing development on the issue of voting rights in the states as well, because we have a lot of concerns about the coming elections and about suppression of voting, and whether they're going to be free and fair. And I know that in the U.S. there has been a very troubling Supreme Court decision. So maybe say a few words about that.
Yeah, as if, everything was doing fine over here and we're just talking about, the troubling things in Israel. Meanwhile, back on the home front, yeah, I'll say in a word, I was against that. And I will just reference my colleague, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who had an important op-ed in the forward. We can maybe include that in the notes of the podcast. But yes, last Wednesday was a ruling by the Supreme Court. The case was actually called Louisiana versus Calais, and where they struck down a map that had created a second majority. It would have created a second majority Black congressional district in the state of Louisiana. So this has to do with gerrymandering. We shouldn't see this in a vacuum because this was a long straight of Supreme Court rulings dating back to 2013 with Shelby County versus Holder, and then again in 2021 with another case called Brnovich versus the DNC. I don't want to get too into the weeds on this, but what 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 makes this so egregious and so problematic is that in those two previous cases in 2013 and 2021, Congress could have passed a law to override this essentially, and now it cannot. And I was thinking, comparing this, with some of the legislative agenda during the judicial coup or the judicial reforms in Israel, and that the right wing was very critical of the Supreme Court for being an activist Supreme Court.
Yeah,
Would you concur
yeah.
here? And I was like, what more example of an activist Supreme Court than what took place, right now in the United States? And it is really a blatant attempt at voter suppression, especially those who are not white. For Black people, for African American people in those specific districts. And, it is very painful for us because, we as the reform movement were so essential in passing the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which was signed in the building of the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, okay, in the conference room, sitting there. I'm thinking about, our hero, both of civil rights and Reform Zionism, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, who, was so instrumental in passing that. And
Yeah,
thinking
I
of Rabbi,
actually there at the RAC
yeah,
offices in December, and I took the,
yeah,
picture of the sign because it is so moving and so
yeah.
amazing, right? To be a part of this groundbreaking law and then seeing now that actually the Supreme Court is taking so many important parts out of this law that are going to dramatically affect the votes in the coming midterms already.
In the
Yeah.
coming, yeah, it'll be implemented right now. Those are only, those are also 5 months away. And look, maybe at the risk of stating the obvious, to say that just access to voting is the number one, symbol and building block or foundation of a healthy democracy. Whenever I, talk about Israel as a democratic and Jewish state, I always ask people, I said, when we say democracy, what do we mean? And people, eventually come up with the response of one person, one vote. And that's it. And that's why it is so deeply troubling. And so, I hope that the Israeli Supreme Court doesn't learn from the United States Supreme Court here in an attempt to
I do,
suppress
yeah.
voters.
I do hope so. I think we're gonna, toward both of our elections, we're going to see a lot of disturbing phenomena that we'll have to, both of us deal with. And I know there's so many disturbing things going on, but obviously we're not sitting quiet. I think both of us are doing whatever we can to push against those troubling, processes and incidents, and to demand action by the authorities, and to raise the
Yeah.
Jewish voice against hatred and against violence and for democracy and pluralism and justice. And I think this just, shows that it's all the more important to raise this voice when, we are under such an attack, and to believe that we can bring about a different future for sure.
And just on that piece on the Supreme Court, I had the honor to hear Rabbi David Saperstein give a sort of a keynote address, and he received an award from the Hebrew Union College this week, in which he said, the time to defend and uphold the institutions of democracy is while they still have power, while they still hold, are in control, and not afterwards.
Yeah, for sure.
So that, I was thinking about that a lot, both in Israel and the United States.
Completely.
So, Orly, really a pleasure to talk about you, even though the discussion was not terribly uplifting and leaves us with many, many challenges. But look, we have to be real. And I think that, my connection to Israel is not just fair weather or when everything is going, is going well, but we have to really take these issues and face them head on, because I think that, Israel can achieve its potential. And we have to do that together. And so,
And we
really
should
grateful.
remember that,
Yeah.
not only the both of us are troubled and outraged, but what we've discussed, but many, many, many Israelis, many, many liberal Jews in North America, so many people share our values, right? We are not like a small minority. There's a large and sizable group which wants a different future and is not willing to accept what is happening as, reality, not willing to accept this as, presenting Jewish values, and we're going to make this happen. So this reality would not continue as it is. We should say that next week we're going to talk in our episode about Jerusalem Day, which is going to be commemorated next week in mid-May, and we're going to host the Haaretz journalist Nir Hasson, who is Haaretz reporter in Jerusalem, to talk about Jerusalem Day and Jerusalem in general. So many challenges, but also a lot of, positive news too. So please, be sure to join us. Josh, it's always a pleasure. And, we should just say that
Absolutely.
conversations like this are exactly why we started this podcast. This podcast exists because we believe Israel can be better, as we said, for all who live here and for all who care about it from afar. But that takes honest conversation and it takes partnership. So if this episode meant something to you, please share it and help us keep this conversation going.
And to stay up to date, subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to help us grow, leave us a 5-star review. Maybe something like, hey, after listening to the Pluralist Podcast, I was about to be terribly depressed, and after this laundry list of terrible things that are happening on. But in fact, now I'm inspired to make Aliyah tomorrow so that I can vote in the next elections. Something like that. You could just, send that, and then send this episode to someone who should be part of this conversation. If you're interested in sponsoring an episode or marking an upcoming occasion, we'd love to hear from you. And as always, if there's a topic you want us to explore reach out and tune in next time on the Pluralist Podcast.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
תודה רבה.